My name is Caitlin, and for most of my life, I mastered the art of appearances. To the world, I was a 42-year-old housewife living in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Minneapolis. A woman who kept the laundry folded, the pantry stocked, the yard trimmed to a postcard sheen. Neighbors waved when I passed by, their smiles carrying the unspoken judgment of suburban perfection. To them, I was ordinary, unremarkable, invisible in the way women are often invisible once they've been safely tucked into the title of wife. But beneath that facade, I lived another life entirely. I was the CEO of Silver Med, a medical equipment distribution company pulling in millions in revenue each year. My annual salary alone was $145,000, money my husband, Brandon, never once suspected existed. He thought of me as a dependent, someone orbiting his world, surviving off whatever scraps he chose to provide. If only he knew the truth. I used to think I was lucky to have him. We met 12 years ago at a friend's gathering when I had just turned 30. Brandon was magnetic back then, warm, attentive, brimming with charisma. He noticed the little things, how I always held my coffee cup in my left hand, how my eyes lit up whenever someone mentioned my favorite band. He had this way of making me feel seen in a crowded room, as though a spotlight had swung and landed squarely on me. For a woman like me, someone who had spent her 20s consumed by work, clawing her way through the male-dominated jungle of business, that attention was intoxicating. The thought of having someone who noticed me beyond quarterly reports and profit margins was irresistible. When he asked me to marry him a year later, I said yes without hesitation. I thought I had found my anchor, my home. But the man I married was not the man who walked me down the aisle. Somewhere between our vows and the years that followed, the warmth evaporated. The man who once whispered promises of forever now offered silence, irritation, and disdain. It started small. Brandon refused to look for a better job, even though his salary barely scraped enough to cover groceries and bills. I offered suggestions gently, thinking he'd appreciate my support. Instead, he bristled. "Don't try to make me live by your standards," he snapped once, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not your employee." The words landed like a slap. I thought he misunderstood, so I tried again. Silver Med had an opening in administration, double his current salary, requiring little more than basic communication skills. I even called HR, asked them to hold the spot for him. When I told him, his face twisted into something hard and cruel. "You think I'm so useless that I need my wife to get me a job?" His voice rose, sharp as broken glass. "Don't meddle in my business." I stood there stunned, my heart pounding. That was the first time I realized the man who once loved me deeply now viewed me as his enemy. Still, I endured. I thought, if I made enough money to keep us comfortable, if I smoothed the rough edges, maybe everything would work out. Every month, I deposited $1,400 into his account, disguised as household support. He burned through it in less than 2 weeks. Sneakers, gaming equipment, nights out with his coworkers. When the money ran dry, he texted complaints about the price of groceries, the cost of gas, how stressful life had become. I stayed silent. Not because I didn't know where the money went, but because I was too exhausted to fight. I negotiated million-dollar contracts by day, then came home to a man who demanded more without ever once asking if I was tired. The hurt wasn't financial, it was emotional. Brandon never saw me, not the way he used to. I became invisible again, but this time in my own home. The breaking point came when my mother, Frances, stopped by one morning to help clean while I was buried in online meetings. Brandon came home, tossed his keys on the counter, and muttered loud enough for her to hear, "Another stranger in the house. I need my peace and quiet." My mother froze, clutching the dish towel in her hands. Heat rose in my chest, anger and shame warring inside me. "She's not a stranger," I said, my voice trembling. "She came here to help us, Brandon. Show her some respect." He shrugged, unbothered. "That's how you see it. Not me. I have a right to feel uncomfortable in my own house." I turned away so he wouldn't see the tears streaming down my face. But inside, something cracked. From that day forward, silence settled over us like a thick fog. We still ate dinner together. We still sat on the couch in the evenings, the TV flickering between us. But there were no goodnight kisses, no spontaneous hugs. Just the routine of two bodies existing side by side, hollowed of warmth. His temper grew shorter. He'd snap if the towels weren't folded his way, if the remote wasn't where he left it. When the coffee machine broke, he blamed me, even though he was the last one to use it. I became the scapegoat for every frustration in his life. One evening, I came home after a brutal meeting with investors. My heels hadn't even clicked fully across the hardwood before Brandon appeared, holding up a wrinkled shirt. "This isn't even ironed. Do you ever do anything right?" I laughed bitterly, my throat burning. Hours earlier, I had stood before a boardroom of men twice my age, securing contracts that would carry Silver Med through the next fiscal year. Yet here I was, being scolded like a child who didn't know how to press fabric. I said nothing. Words twisted in his mouth until they became weapons, and I was too tired to bleed. Even when illness struck, he remained indifferent. I once spent 3 days shivering in bed with a fever so high I could barely stand. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and muttered, "Hurry up and get better." "I don't have time to take care of you." Those words chilled me more than the fever. They weren't the words of a husband. They were the words of a stranger forced to tolerate my existence. Loneliness wrapped tighter around me, night after night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why I, a strong, successful woman who had overcome every obstacle, remained trapped in a marriage that drained me of everything but despair. I couldn't tell anyone, not even my mother, who adored me and sensed when something was wrong. When she asked, I lied. "Everything's fine." I couldn't bear for her to know how broken I was, but Brandon dragged her into it anyway. One Saturday, she arrived with a pot of my favorite stew and a basket of fruit. She was halfway through telling me a story when Brandon walked in. He looked at her, sighed dramatically, and muttered, "Again, there's always someone sitting around this house." My mother's smile faltered, but she stayed polite. "I'm just dropping by to see my daughter. I'm not intruding." Brandon opened the fridge, grabbed a drink, and said casually, "I don't want dinner with outsiders. Some people don't know how to respect boundaries." I froze. My mother hesitated, then placed the stew gently on the counter. "I think I should go," she whispered. Her eyes met mine, full of sorrow. "I'll come by another time." When the door closed behind her, the silence in the house felt suffocating. My heart pounded with rage and grief. "Do you realize how cruel you're being?" I demanded. Brandon shrugged. "I'm just being honest. If you can't handle it, that's your problem." I stood in the kitchen for a long time, the smell of stew hanging in the air like a ghost of the life I once believed in. The walls of my marriage were collapsing, one brick at a time, and then came the moment that would shatter it completely. It happened at the office. I don't remember falling, only the dizzy haze, the way the lights overhead blurred into streaks before everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in a hospital bed, an IV in my arm, my head heavy, as though I'd been dropped into the aftermath of a storm. The world I thought I controlled was slipping from my grasp, and I had no idea that the next words I would hear. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sterile buzz that pressed against my temples. My body felt heavy, each limb anchored to the stiff hospital mattress. I blinked against the whiteness of the room, the antiseptic smell clinging to the air like a second skin. Somewhere beyond the curtain, I could hear the shuffle of nurses, the muted roll of a cart, the cough of another patient. But in here, there was only me, and the doctor who had just altered the trajectory of my life with a few clipped words. "A tumor in your pancreas. Stage 1, caught early, but we need to start treatment immediately." His voice was calm, professional, but I couldn't escape the undertow beneath it. A tumor, treatment, chemo. The words swirled like fragments of broken glass, slicing through the thin membrane of denial I'd always wrapped around myself. I wasn't afraid of dying. Not exactly. What terrified me was the thought of facing this battle alone. That night, I stared at the pale ceiling tiles until my eyes burned. The machines beeped a steady rhythm beside me, a cruel lullaby reminding me that my body had betrayed me. I texted Brandon once, then twice. No reply. I called, and his phone rang out before sinking into voicemail silence. I told myself he was busy, that he would come, that marriage vows in sickness and in health weren't just empty words. But when the door finally swung open days later and his silhouette filled the frame, I knew. He wasn't here to see me. He didn't even offer a hello. didn't sit by the bed, didn't brush the damp hair from my forehead. He walked in like a businessman arriving late to a meeting, dropped a manila folder on the table, and spoke in a tone so devoid of warmth it chilled me deeper than any diagnosis ever could. "I've filed for divorce," he said flatly. "The house and the car will go to me. That's fair. As for you." He paused, his gaze raking over my frail form, the IV lines, the hospital gown. "Well, I don't even know how long you'll be around." For a heartbeat, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Not because of the betrayal. I had been expecting abandonment in some form, though not like this. No, what gutted me was the absolute coldness, the way his voice didn't even crack. He didn't come to comfort me. He came to claim assets, like a scavenger circling a carcass. I pressed my lips together, forcing the tremor out of my voice. "Take whatever you want, Brandon. Thank you for coming." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise. Disappointment, maybe, that I didn't crumble. He shrugged, muttered, "Not like you have a choice," and turned on his heel. The door clicked shut, and I stared at it for a long time. Then I smiled. A cold, quiet smile that tasted like steel on my tongue. He thought he'd discarded me. He had no idea he'd just woken something far more dangerous. 3 days later, Eric walked into my room. My CFO, my most trusted ally. He carried no flowers, no sympathy, only a leather briefcase and the steady eyes of a man who had waited years for this moment. "Caitlin," he said softly, pulling up a chair, "are you ready?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes, tomorrow." Inside the briefcase were the documents I needed, the keys to dismantle Brandon's life brick by brick. For years, I had shielded my identity, operating under my mother's name to protect my privacy. Brandon had never known that the quiet wife who left folded laundry on the couch was also the CEO of Silver Med, the company responsible for more than half of his employer's revenue. That secrecy had been my kindness, my mistake. Now it would be my weapon. The next morning, at precisely 8 a.m., a termination letter was dispatched to Vital Tech, Brandon's company. By 3 p.m., my phone buzzed with a call from their CEO, Peterson, his voice strained with confusion. "We're surprised by this decision," he said carefully. "If there's an issue, perhaps we can discuss." I let silence hang for a beat before answering, calm but merciless. "One of your employees has demonstrated inappropriate behavior toward female colleagues, signs of asset misuse as well. I cannot condone it. Our partnership is over." A pause. "Which employee?" I said his name like a verdict. "Brandon Scott." That evening, Brandon came home late. His skin looked ashen, his steps slow, like the ground beneath him had started to crumble. He didn't speak right away. Just opened the fridge, poured water, stared at nothing. Finally, in a voice that barely carried, "I got laid off." I closed the book in my lap and set it down gently, savoring the moment. Not surprising. He looked up, startled. "How do you?" "Because I made it happen." I rose, walked to the desk, and pulled out an envelope. My voice was low, controlled, laced with a sharpness he'd never heard from me before. "I'm the CEO of Silver Med, Brandon, the company you bragged about landing, the company you thought you had impressed." His mouth fell open, eyes darting as though searching for escape. "All these years," I continued, stepping closer, "I paid the bills. I erased your credit card debt. I funded your nephew's tuition when your cousin fell on hard times. I gave you a monthly allowance, more than you ever earned. And you thought I was dependent on you." I placed the envelope in his trembling hands. "Here are the counter-divorce papers. The house is mine. You have 30 days to leave." He tore it open, scanning the pages with shaking fingers. His lips formed words, but no sound came out. I leaned in, close enough for him to smell the antiseptic still clinging to me from the hospital. "You've lived in my shadow for too long, Brandon. Now you'll learn what it feels like to survive without me." I turned away, leaving him frozen in silence, drowning in the truth. 3 nights later, my hospital phone rang past midnight. I was weak from chemo, my veins burning, my reflection in the mirror unrecognizable with thinning hair and sallow skin. The screen flashed his name. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Caitlin," his voice cracked, desperation spilling through the line. "Please, just listen. I was wrong. I lost everything. The house, it's going into foreclosure. The company blacklisted me. No one will hire me. I can't live like this. Please give me another chance." I let the silence stretch, listening to his ragged breathing. Once I would have given anything to hear contrition in his tone. But now, it only sounded like a drowning man clutching for the lifeline he had once cut loose himself. A chance? My voice was ice. You had a decade of chances, Brandon. 10 years to love me, respect me, stand beside me. You chose not to. And now, when the world has stripped away your illusions, you come crawling back? His voice cracked. I know you're angry, but we were happy once. Please remember that. I smiled faintly. Do you remember the name Alyssa? The line went dead silent. I could hear him inhale sharply, a hitch in his breath. How do you know about her? The CEO of Vital mentioned it during our final call. They investigated an internal complaint. Turns out their prize logistics employee was sleeping with a 24-year-old intern, Alyssa Morgan. Ring a bell? Should I describe the hotel invoices or the selfies in the office? He stammered. It wasn't. It's not what you think. You're right. I cut him off. It was worse than I thought. I hung up, blocked his number, and called Eliza, my lawyer. Add a no-contact clause, and prepare a civil suit for infidelity damages. By morning, she arrived with a thick folder of evidence. Flirtatious messages, hotel reservations, time-stamped photos. Proof stacked like bricks in a wall I no longer had to climb. Eliza's eyes glittered. With this, we'll win. I filed for $85,000 in damages. I nodded, not because I wanted the money, but because I wanted the record sealed with truth. Brandon's name spread like wildfire in the local business community. Vital Tech severed ties. His termination files circulated discreetly among industry partners. He became toxic, a man no company wanted to touch. He sold his car to chip away at the debt he'd once so proudly accumulated. Friends vanished. Collection agencies filled the silence with late-night calls. And eventually, with no options left, he took a night shift job at a warehouse. His paycheck barely enough to cover rent in a dingy apartment he shared with an old acquaintance. As for Alyssa, she disappeared. Word reached me that her family, desperate to preserve their reputation, had whisked her away to a farm in Iowa, cutting all ties with her past. Brandon was left with nothing but the hollow echo of the empire he thought he controlled. And me? I stepped out of the fire reborn. I revised my financial plans. No more husband's expenses column. I instructed Eric to hand COO responsibilities to a new hire so I could finally slow down. For years, I had lived split in two, the powerful CEO in boardrooms and the invisible wife at home. Now the mask had fallen, and I no longer needed to hide. One crisp autumn evening, I stood on the balcony of my new home. The wind curled through my short, regrown hair, carrying the scent of pine and earth. My body was healing. My company was thriving. And for the first time in years, the silence around me felt like peace, not punishment. I didn't need Brandon. The first morning I woke in my new home, I thought I was dreaming. Light spilled across the floorboards in soft ribbons, golden and unhurried, as though time itself had slowed. The air carried the faint tang of pine and the clean chill of autumn. From the balcony, I could see the surface of the lake glimmering like glass, rippling gently under the brush of the wind. I closed my eyes, letting the silence wrap around me. For the first time in years, silence wasn't suffocating. It was liberation. The house wasn't grand like the old one Brandon and I had shared. There were no granite countertops, no cavernous halls echoing with emptiness. This place was modest, humble, but wholly mine. Every corner breathed peace. No raised voices, no footsteps pounding angrily across the floor, no eyes watching me as if I were a burden. Here, I was free. My body was still healing. The chemo had taken its toll. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger with pale skin, thin hair, and eyes shadowed by exhaustion. But within those eyes burned something fiercer than sickness. Determination. Every treatment had felt like drowning, each infusion dragging me into a dark sea. But every time I surfaced, I clawed back to air. And as the weeks turned into months, the doctor's words shifted, promising results, shrinking mass. Until finally, one crisp morning, the oncologist smiled as he slid the papers across the desk. "Caitlin, you're clear." I didn't cry. I simply inhaled deeply, as if I had been holding my breath for years, and whispered a thank you. To God, to fate, to the unrelenting will that had kept me alive when Brandon tried to discard me. I had beaten the illness. But more importantly, I had beaten the part of myself that once believed I was nothing without a man. News of Brandon reached me in fragments. whispers carried by colleagues, lawyers, and the grapevine of a small business community. He was living in Brooklyn Park now, crammed into a friend's dingy apartment. The car he'd once polished like a trophy was gone, sold to scrape together rent and payments on his mounting debts. His credit cards, once swiped freely for sneakers, games, and dinners with interns, were maxed, the balances growing heavier by the day. At first, he tried to claw back. He sent emails to Silver Med, begging for a meeting. He showed up at the building once, only to be turned away by security. Word spread quickly. Brandon Scott, once a logistics employee with a promising future, was blacklisted. No partner companies would touch him. He eventually landed on the graveyard shift at a delivery center. Nights spent unloading boxes, the weight breaking his back, the paycheck barely enough to keep the lights on. He became a ghost in the city, seen only in the harsh fluorescence of warehouses and the dim alleys behind payday loan offices. Collection agencies called constantly. Friends stopped answering. Even Alyssa, the intern he'd gambled our marriage for, had vanished into exile, her family dragging her back to Iowa to bury the scandal. Brandon had lost everything, and I felt nothing. No triumph, no glee, just clarity. His downfall wasn't my victory. It was simply the inevitable collapse of a man who had built his life on arrogance and lies. As for me, I re-entered my company on my own terms. The day I walked back into Silver Med, the office erupted in applause. My employees, my team, the people who had carried the company forward while I fought for my life, stood to greet me. Eric handed me a mug that read, "Welcome back, boss." It wasn't the grand boardrooms or the revenue numbers that filled me with pride. It was them, their loyalty, their respect. The knowledge that I had built something real, something enduring, while Brandon had squandered everything handed to him. I wasn't the same woman who had once tried to juggle board meetings with ironing shirts for a husband who never thanked her. I wasn't the invisible housewife hiding behind a facade. I was Caitlin, whole, unapologetic, unbound. In the months that followed, invitations trickled in. A business partner who had always admired my resilience asked me to dinner. An old college friend reached out, reminding me of the laughter we once shared. Even strangers who had read about my story online sent letters, offering admiration, connection, possibilities. I declined them all, not because my heart had closed forever, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone else to validate my existence. Happiness wasn't something a man could give me. It was something I had forged in the fire of betrayal, sickness, and survival. One evening, Eric visited me at the lake house. We sat on the porch, the sunset painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. He leaned back, sipping his coffee, a rare smile softening his usually guarded features. "Ever thought about remarrying?" he asked, half teasing. I laughed, the sound light and free. "Not right now. Maybe someday. But for now, I'm happy like this." And I meant it. The breeze carried the scent of pine, the water shimmered, and for the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing down on me. Not illness, not betrayal, not the suffocating need to be everything for a man who gave nothing in return. Just me, alive, whole, free. Brandon faded into the background of my life, a shadow I rarely thought about. I heard, months later, that he had moved out of his friend's apartment and into a cramped studio, that he owed more money than he could ever repay, that his nights were filled with the shrill ring of collection calls, his days with the backbreaking labor of hauling packages no one else wanted to touch. Once, I might have pitied him. Now, I simply didn't care, because the greatest revenge was never his ruin. It was my freedom, the freedom to wake each morning to the sound of birds instead of arguments, to sit by the lake and feel the sun on my skin, without dread of what waited inside. To run a company on my own terms, to laugh with friends, to drink tea in the quiet of a home that was entirely mine. The freedom to know that I no longer lived in anyone's shadow, that I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, my self-respect, and that was something Brandon could never take from me, no matter how he tried. As autumn gave way to winter, I stood on the balcony one evening, a mug of hot tea warming my hands. The air was crisp, the lake already dusted with ice. I thought of everything that had led me here, the betrayal, the illness, the nights I had lain awake wondering if I'd survive. I had survived. And more than that, I had become someone stronger than I had ever imagined. I whispered into the cold night air, my